ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we are looking into our next lesson for Chapter 18, Radical Reconstruction. Now, if you remember a couple of days ago, I told you that with President Johnson taking over for President Lincoln, who had been assassinated, President Johnson had different views on how Reconstruction should have operated than Lincoln, and the same can be said about Congress. Congress had very different views on how the South should be brought back into the Union. And I said at the end of that lesson that from here on out, it would be the President versus Congress on this issue of Reconstruction. So today, in our lesson about radical Reconstruction, we're going to be looking at some of the steps taken to bring the South back into the Union during Reconstruction. That's the whole point of this time period, is that the Civil War is now over, so let's move on as a country, as a united nation. So we're going to look at the steps that were taken to bring the South back into the Union. But first, let's look at our key terms. Now, our key terms for today are black codes, which we've touched on in the past. A radical is just a person who wanted to make drastic changes in society. There can be radical everything, but a radical is someone who wants to make a drastic change in society. The 14th Amendment, which we looked at in the introduction, but we'll discuss a little bit more today. Radical Reconstruction, which is the time period we'll be looking at today. The First Reconstruction Act, and what it means to impeach, what the actual term impeach means, and the 15th Amendment will be the final thing we talk about today. So a lot of stuff, we got a lot of ground to cover. So as we start, I have a proposition for you. I would like you to take a piece of paper and divide it into, and on one side write Radical Republicans, and on the other side write President Johnson, similar to the piece of paper we're looking at right now. Now, as we go through today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Radical Republicans. Specifically, we're going to talk about laws and acts of Congress that they propose, and then President Johnson's reaction to those laws. So I want you to write down the reasons for that legislation being proposed. So, for instance, Law 1, the reason why it was proposed. Law 2, Johnson's reaction. So I want you to do that to help us get a better understanding of what was occurring between Congress and the President at this time. So I'm not going to tell you how many laws were proposed, but I want you to write down the reasons they were proposed and then the reaction to that. And this will come in handy, wink wink, that was more of a blink, but you get the gist. This will come in handy in the future. Alright, so let's backtrack a little bit. We've been talking about specifically things going on in the North and in the Union as a result of the Civil War, but in the South, they perceived the war in a much different fashion than in the North. Many Southerners didn't feel that they had done anything wrong in the Civil War, so they were not apologetic, nor did they want to suddenly recognize all African Americans as free, specifically as equals. So a lot of these states hurried to ratify the 13th Amendment so that they could then be let back into the Union. Remember, that was President Johnson's stipulations for Reconstruction, that if the states ratified the 13th Amendment, then they could be let back in the Union and everything could start back up, and it was like no harm, no foul, everything is forgiven. So many of these states hurried up to ratify the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, but passed what they call black codes. And we've discussed black codes in the past, but in this instance, black codes were laws that limited the rights of freedmen. These codes did grant some rights that had previously the slaves did not have, like marriage and the right to own property, but they were really geared to keeping freedmen out of any political power. Freedmen were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to own guns. They were not allowed to serve on juries. So they could get married and own property, but that was about it. And as far as jobs were concerned, some states allowed freedmen to work, but they had to sign one-year contracts. And without these contracts, some freedmen were forced back onto plantations. Does that sound fair to you? And speaking of these contracts, don't you need to be able to read and write in order to fully understand a contract? Now, don't forget that before the Civil War, it was illegal to teach slaves to read or write in the South. So you have to sign a one-year contract in order to get a job, but up until that point, if it was illegal to teach for you to learn how to read and write, there's a good chance you're not going to understand this contract that you're having to fill out and having to sign. So where freedmen got their freedom, but it was very, very, very limited. And equality was not even a thought of at this point. So that's what's going on in many of these southern states. But in Congress, the Republicans were outraged. They blamed these new black codes on President Johnson because his Reconstruction plan was way too easy. They were also outraged that there were new reports of violence against freedmen. Houses, schools, churches were being burned, and groups were killed during voting riots. So a joint committee on Reconstruction was formed, and they said that the South was trying to keep slavery going as long as possible, even though they weren't calling it slavery. So after Johnson ignores this report from the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans swore that they would take over all of the responsibilities of Reconstruction. And like I said, it was Congress versus the president on the issues of Reconstruction. Well, here we can see it starting to play out.
Northerners' worst fears were that the former Confederates were attempting to bring back slavery. For example, many planters needed workers on their land. Often, blacks were offered the job to farm the planter's land in exchange for a small share of the harvested crop. This type of work was called sharecropping. Unfortunately, many planters often deceived the black workers and confined them to one plantation, much as slavery had done. In the South, from 1865 to 1866, laws called the Black Codes were made specifically to keep blacks from being free. Many communities required blacks to be off the streets by a specified hour. Other communities required special permission from their employer to enter a town. And often, blacks were not allowed to handle firearms or other weapons. The Black Codes passed by the Southerners convinced the radical Republicans in Congress that the Lincoln-Johnson plan did not help blacks. Congress challenged the president's policy and promoted their own Reconstruction laws.
Leading the radical Republicans were these two men, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania in the House of Representatives and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts in the Senate. And the two main goals of the radical Republicans were to, one, break the power of the wealthy planters who had long ruled the South, and two, ensure that freedmen got the right to vote. Now, to accomplish these goals, the radicals needed the support of the more moderate Republicans, because this group of radical Republicans was a very small part of the House and the Senate. So they needed the moderate Republicans, or because they were the largest group in Congress. Now, the moderates and the radicals disagreed on a lot of issues, but they were united when it came to keeping Southern Democrats out of power in Congress and keeping Republicans in control. Remember that old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Well, even though the radicals and the moderates had a lot of things that they disagreed on, they were unified on the fact that they wanted to keep Republicans in power in Congress. So in 1866, in April of that year, they proposed a Civil Rights Act that would grant U.S. citizenship to all African Americans. President Johnson vetoed the bill. So, first piece of legislation, a Civil Rights Act which would grant U.S. citizenship to all African Americans. And they hoped in doing so that these African Americans would then be loyal to the Republicans and keep them in Congress. President Johnson's reaction to this piece of legislation was to veto the bill. But Congress was able to override his veto, so this Civil Rights Act, this first Civil Rights Act, went into law. Now, even though the Civil Rights Act went into law, which would give citizenship to all African Americans, there was a possibility that the Supreme Court could rule that the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional, because this was the same Supreme Court that had ruled in the Dred Scott case that all African Americans were not really citizens, headed by Roger Taney. So, to keep the court from ruling against the Civil Rights Act, the Republicans proposed the 14th Amendment, which would define a U.S. citizen as any person, quote, born or naturalized in the United States. But this didn't apply to Native Americans. The amendment also gave every citizen the same rights under the law, and it forbade any states from denying a person, quote, life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So states wouldn't be allowed to discriminate against a citizen without some legal ground. You could still deny life, liberty, or property, but there had to be legal precedent and there had to be legal ground for doing so, like a criminal conviction. You couldn't just take away somebody's life, liberty, or property willy-nilly. There had to be legal ground to do so. Any male 21 or older was now allowed to vote, and if a state denied this right without legal reasons, like a criminal case, that state would lose representation in Congress. And Republicans hoped that this amendment would give African Americans in the South some basic political rights, but it would really take until the 1950s for this to truly take effect in all Southern states, and we'll get into that. So, 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. 14th Amendment defines a U.S. citizen as any person born or naturalized in the United States and gives every citizen the same rights under the law and forbade states from denying a person life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So this is huge.
After the Civil War, Congress passed 3 amendments to the Constitution that banned slavery and tried to strengthen the civil rights of people of all races. One of these amendments, the 14th Amendment, says that every person is entitled to equal protection of the law, and that no state can make or enforce a law that deprives someone of life, liberty, or property because of that person's race. In 1896, the 14th Amendment was cited to challenge a Louisiana law that prohibited African Americans from riding in the same railroad cars as whites. In a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, opponents of this law argued before the Supreme Court that it denied African Americans their right to equal protection under the law. But the Supreme Court upheld the Louisiana law. The majority of the justices argued that as long as the separate railroad cars were equal, the law didn't deprive African Americans of their rights. This became known as the separate but equal doctrine. One justice, John Marshall Harlan, voted against the others. Harlan wrote, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The thin disguise of equal accommodations for passengers will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done. Harlan, of course, was right. Segregated or separate facilities were unequal. But for decades, the Supreme Court's decision kept segregation legal, not only in railroad cars, but in waiting rooms, hotels, restaurants, and particularly in schools.
Perhaps one of the areas where separate but equal did the most damage was in the area of education. By saying separate but equal, that meant that African Americans went to separate schools, which they were already doing. But more significantly, it meant that African Americans were not going to have access to the same kinds of services as whites did.
President Johnson did not like the 14th Amendment, and he even went so far as to encourage Southern states not to ratify it. And likewise, it became an issue in the 1866 elections. And as Johnson traveled around the North, he encouraged voters to reject the ideals of the radicals. However, there was violence in July of that year in New Orleans. So we're in 1866. July 1866, there's violence in New Orleans that resulted in 34 dead African Americans. And it was this issue that helped push many Northern voters to realize that stronger measures needed to be in place for Reconstruction. And in the end, Republicans won majorities in both houses of Congress, which was a disaster for President Johnson. And this new Republican Congress was prepared to completely take over Reconstruction, and starting in 1867, the period known as Radical Reconstruction really began and really got its foothold. And it all started with the first Reconstruction Act in March of 1867. And the first Reconstruction Act threw out all Southern governments that refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, which ended up actually being all of the states that had become the Confederacy, except Tennessee. Tennessee had ratified the 14th Amendment, so it was kind of exempt from radical Reconstruction. So that was the first thing it did. It also took these states and divided the South into 5 military districts. And this was meant to enforce Reconstruction. But in the South, this was seen as their homes being put under military control. So under radical Reconstruction, in order to rejoin the Union, Southern states had to do a couple of things. They had to write a new constitution for their state, which would say, among other things, that they would allow African Americans the right to vote, and they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. With these new state constitutions in place, then it was time to set up new state governments. But former Confederate officials were not allowed to vote, so they were completely exempt from these new state governments. Now, most white Southerners, as an act of protest, refused to vote. But with military protection, many freedmen had finally gotten the right to vote, and they used that opportunity to vote, and many Republicans gained control of these new Southern governments. So, under radical Reconstruction, Southern states had to write a new constitution that would allow African Americans the right to vote, and they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. However, as an act of protest, many of the white Southerners refused to vote, but since they were being protected by the military, many freedmen took advantage of their first opportunities to vote and voted Republicans into office in these new state governments. So, kind of to bring it all together, to wrap it up, with the death of President Lincoln, the plan for pulling the nation back together kind of really just spiraled out of control. And this chart shows all of these rival plans for Reconstruction. And as you can see, the 10% plan that President Lincoln came up with in 1863 went through a lot of changes before the passage of the Reconstruction Act in 1867.
The Republicans were gaining more support in Congress. President Johnson was losing support and credibility. Despite President Johnson's insistence that old Southern leaders continue to rule the South, Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act of 1867.
And so it is in 1867 that you get the Reconstruction Act, which divides the South up into 5 military districts, which lays the basis for black people to participate in voting, and requires the Southern states, or the Southerners who want to participate as voters, to take a loyalty oath to the federal government and to renounce their allegiances to the Confederacy.
This act divided the Southern states, excluding Tennessee, which was already reconstructed, into 5 military districts, each under a Union Major General. Union Army troops were stationed in Southern states to maintain order and enforce the law.
The problem here, of course, was that the Southerners were extremely proud people. And they felt that they were being treated in a fashion in which no other white people in the history of the world had ever been treated. That is, that they were being forced now to live with black people as their equals. And in 1866 and 1867, they made it quite clear that this was completely unacceptable.
As I said before, Johnson did not like the 14th Amendment and even told Southern states not to ratify it. But once it was ratified, it was his duty to execute the new law even though he didn't agree with it and though he didn't like it. He spoke out against it and even fired military officials that supported radical Reconstruction. For this, members of Congress voted to impeach him, and this term impeach means, quote, to bring formal charges against the president. So an impeachment trial is a trial in which you actually bring formal charges against an official, in this case, the president. And according to the Constitution, a president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, if he was found guilty by a 2/3 vote in the Senate, he could be removed from office. So remember that. You can be impeached for treason, bribery, other high crimes, or misdemeanors. That's it. Can you impeach a president because you don't like him or you don't agree with him? No. There have to be specific things that he has done wrong, and as I stated, those things are bribery, treason, high crimes, or other misdemeanors. And during Johnson's impeachment trial, it became clear that he really hadn't done anything wrong or anything worthy of being impeached. But despite pressure from other senators, several Republicans refused to vote for impeachment because they knew that the Constitution didn't allow them to remove a president just because he disagreed with them on these issues. And in the end, the vote was 35-19 for impeachment. But if you know your math, which hopefully you all do, then you'll see that the vote actually needed to be 36-18 in order for there to be a 2/3 majority. And if you weren't able to do quick math like that, that's fine. I had to use my calculator. So the vote was 35-19. But in order for him to be impeached, it needed to be 36-18. So Johnson was not impeached, but at that point, this is 1867, he really didn't have much longer to be president either.
President Johnson was furious at Congress for boxing him in and taking away much of his power. By now, his opponents were calling him the dead dog of the White House.
Within a period of less than a year, Congress has attempted to strip the executive department of its essential power. I have been abused. I have been slandered. I have been maligned.
Johnson especially opposed Congress's Reconstruction Act, as Charles Nordoff of the Evening Post sarcastically editorialized.
He expressed the most bitter hatred of the measure in all its parts, declaring that the white people of the South, poor, quiet, unoffending, harmless, were to be trodden underfoot to protect. He is a pig-headed man with only one idea, a bitter opposition to universal suffrage.
In 1867, disgusted with Johnson's attitudes, the Republicans in Congress decided to get rid of him. For 2 months, the House of Representatives debated. Finally, House members voted to impeach Andrew Johnson.
Impeachment of me for violating the Constitution? Have I not been struggling ever since I have been in this chair to uphold the Constitution, which they trample underfoot?
Now the matter went to the Senate. Only they could try a president. Thaddeus Stevens was one of those who presented Congress's case.
I accuse him in the name of the House of Representatives of having perpetrated a foul offense against his country. He has sought to convert a land of freedom into a land of slaves. This people have put the chief of traitors on trial and now demand judgment of his misconduct.
If President Johnson were convicted of high crimes and misdemeanors, he would be thrown out of office. On Saturday, May 16th, the vote began. As expected, all the Democrats voted not guilty. Republican after Republican voted guilty. But behind the scenes, Johnson had been making deals with several Republican senators in return for the promise not to vote for impeachment. The final tally was 35-19, just one vote short of the total needed for conviction. President Johnson would remain in office.
Johnson really only had a few more months to serve as president before the next election was going to come up. Now, due to the internal strife with his party, Johnson did not run again. So he had been sworn in because he was Lincoln's vice president, but he did not run again. And he opted to return to his home state of Tennessee. So instead of nominating what would be the incumbent, they nominated former Union General Ulysses S. Grant, hero of the Civil War, as their candidate. The Democrats chose Horatio Seymour of New York, and while Seymour managed to get 47% of the popular vote, he really only acquired 20% or 27%, excuse me, of the electoral vote. So he was popular, just not enough to get the requisite electoral votes. At this time, the Republicans were in control of both houses of Congress, but they wanted a popular public figure as the president because of their continued battles and strife with President Johnson. So with Grant, they got that popular figure. So you now have a Republican war hero as the president and a Republican majority in both houses of Congress. But there was still a whole section of the country that could not vote. So to correct this, Congress proposed the 15th Amendment, which in 1869 would give all African American males in the North the right to vote. They supported it also because it could potentially give Republicans more votes in upcoming elections, but honestly, regardless of those reasons, all African American males 21 and over in the United States were now allowed to vote. So even though the reasons were not completely altruistic, all African American males were now able to vote. This is huge. Which brings us back to our assignment. Now, you remember this sheet that I told you I wanted you to fill out and hold on because it's going to come in handy. Well, you don't have to turn it in today, but it will be helpful for the upcoming quiz. So I want you to hold on to it and use it as you're studying for the upcoming quiz, because there's a really good chance that there's going to be questions dealing directly with the laws that were proposed by the radical Republicans and President Johnson's reaction to those laws. All right. With that having been said, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.